The relentless moan of the Yukon wind was Elara's constant companion, a mournful, drawn-out cry that seemed to echo the emptiness within her. She stood by the small, frosted window of her cabin, watching the endless expanse of snow stretch to meet the bruised, grey sky. Each breath bloomed into a white cloud, a fleeting ghost in the biting cold that permeated every crevice of her small dwelling. Her hands, calloused from years of setting traps and chopping wood, instinctively pulled the wolf fur trim of her parka tighter around her face, the rough texture a familiar comfort against the biting air. This small cabin, a testament to her fierce independence, was a solitary beacon against the overwhelming might of the Alaskan wilderness. Inside, the fire, fed with painstaking care, offered only a meager warmth, its flickering light a dance of defiance against the omnipresent frost that coated the window panes. Elara had chosen this life, this stark isolation, to escape a past that clung to her like the icy grip of winter. The raw honesty of the wilderness, its brutal demands, offered a strange kind of solace compared to the complicated deceit of the world she'd left behind. Here, survival was a tangible thing, a daily battle won through grit and sheer will, not through false smiles or whispered promises. Her only companions were the distant howls of wolves, the sharp crack of ice on the nearby river, and the silent, watchful sentinel of the ancient spruce trees. Loneliness, a familiar ache, was a constant, dull throb beneath the surface, a silent partner in her self-imposed exile. As the last sliver of sun bled across the horizon, painting the snow in fleeting hues of fiery orange and deep, bruised purple, Elara wondered if the fragile warmth of human connection, a warmth she once knew, would ever find its way back to her. The endless night descended, bringing with it an even deeper, more profound cold, both outside and, she feared, within her very soul. She turned from the window, the faint creak of the floorboards under her worn boots, the only sound in the deepening silence. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of survival. The rhythm of her trap lines dictated Elara's every movement, checking snares, resetting traps, skinning pelts, and endlessly chopping wood to feed the hungry maw of her stove. The vast, unbroken silence was her only soundtrack, occasionally punctuated by the shriek of a hawk or the distant rumble of an ice break. Then on a morning as crisp and clear as shattered glass, a thin, almost imperceptible wisp of smoke caught her eye. It curled lazily upwards, a dark thread against the brilliant white of the distant tree line, near the winding path of the frozen river. Her heart, long dormant to the quickening pulse of novelty, gave an unexpected lurch. Human presence. It was a rare, almost unheard-of sight in this desolate stretch of the Yukon, where most trappers moved through like ghosts, leaving barely a trace. Caution, a lesson etched deep by harsh experience, was her first instinct. She moved with the silent grace of a seasoned hunter, retrieving her worn but reliable rifle. Its familiar weight in her hands was a cold comfort. She began her trek through the deep, untouched snow, the soft crunch-crunch of her mukluks, the only sound disturbing the pristine quiet. As she drew closer, the scent of wood smoke grew stronger, mingling with the sharp, clean smell of pine. It led her to a small, almost hidden camp, nestled snugly amongst a cluster of snow-laden spruce. A lone figure, heavily bundled in furs, was tending a small, expertly built fire, his back to her. He was clearly a trapper. She could see the stretched pelts on frames near his lean-to, drying in the frigid air. He moved with a quiet, efficient competence, his every action honed by countless hours in the wild. Elara observed him from a distance, her body a shadow amongst the dense undergrowth, her senses on high alert. She noted the broad set of his shoulders, the way he handled his axe with an almost fluid strength, splitting logs with practiced ease. His movements were not rushed but deliberate, assured. She had encountered other trappers before, often grizzled, suspicious men, quick to anger and quicker to draw a weapon. Yet something about this man, in the quiet confidence of his actions, felt different. She couldn't pinpoint why, but a strange, unfamiliar blend of unease and a forgotten flicker of anticipation stirred within her. She remained hidden, watching, her breath a silent fog in the frigid air, wondering what this unexpected intrusion meant for her carefully constructed solitude. Their initial encounter was a study in taciturn caution. Elara finally made her presence known, emerging from the shadows like a spirit of the forest. Silas, the trapper, startled only slightly, his movements slow and deliberate as he turned. His eyes, the color of chips of glacial ice, met hers with a flicker of suspicion, a mirror of her own hardened gaze. Words, when they came, were few and clipped, exchanged like precious commodities in the biting cold. He spoke of the scarcity of game, the brutal grip of the winter, and the long, arduous trek of his traplines, his voice rough and unaccustomed to prolonged conversation. Elara offered only terse replies, revealing nothing of her past, only the stark realities of her current solitary existence. She noticed the way his gaze lingered, a subtle curiosity that she found unsettling, even a little intrusive. Silas, with an unspoken understanding of her need for space, eventually set up his camp a respectable distance from her small cabin. Yet his presence, however unobtrusive, was a constant, undeniable reminder that she was no longer truly alone. He would occasionally leave a freshly caught rabbit or a brace of ptarmigan on her doorstep, a silent offering, the gesture devoid of expectation. Elara, in turn, would reciprocate with a small pouch of dried berries from her meager stores, or a meticulously mended piece of his worn equipment left outside his lean-to. These small, wordless exchanges, acts of mutual respect born of shared hardship, slowly began to chip away at the formidable wall she had erected around herself. The initial distrust lingered, a persistent shadow between them, but it was gradually being replaced by a grudging, almost imperceptible respect. They were two solitary figures in an immense, unforgiving wilderness, bound by the unspoken understanding of survival in a land where weakness meant death. The days continued to be harsh, but the stark, unyielding isolation of her existence had been subtly altered, introducing a new, fragile dynamic to her solitary life, a thin thread of connection in the vast, cold emptiness. Weeks bled into months, each passing day deepening the silent rhythm of their coexistence. Silas, true to his nature, proved to be a man of few words, his actions speaking volumes where words would have felt clumsy and unnecessary. He never once pressed her about her past, never dared to pry into the shadowed corners of her solitude. He simply existed, a quiet, dependable presence in the vast, white world. Sometimes their paths would converge on their respective trap lines, and they would find themselves working near each other. The only sounds, the soft creaking of the snow underfoot, the sharp snap of frozen branches, and the occasional mournful call of a raven soaring overhead. There was an unexpected comfort in this shared silence, a strange intimacy that transcended the need for conversation. Elara found herself observing him more closely, noticing the quiet strength in his hands as he meticulously skinned a freshly caught fox, the way his eyes would intently scan the vast horizon, reading the subtle shifts in the clouds for signs of impending weather. One particularly fierce blizzard, a whiteout that swallowed the entire landscape in its swirling fury, forced Silas to seek refuge in Elara's small cabin. The cramped space, usually her sanctuary, suddenly felt smaller, filled with the unfamiliar warmth of another body, the scent of wood smoke and damp fur mingling in the air. They sat by the roaring fire, the storm a cacophony of howling wind and rattling timbers outside, their conversation limited to the bare essentials of survival, the diminishing woodpile, the dwindling food stores. Yet, in the flickering light of the flames, Elara found herself studying the rugged lines on his weathered face, the deep-set weariness in his eyes that so uncannily mirrored her own. She began to see past the gruff exterior, sensing a quiet kindness beneath the hardened shell. She remembered his blunt, almost cruel words from their first meeting, "You're too cold to love any man." That assessment had stung her at the time, a painful echo of a truth she believed about herself. Yet, as the storm raged and the fire crackled its defiant warmth, a subtle, unfamiliar heat began to spread through her, a warmth she hadn't felt in years. It was a fragile flicker of hope, a tiny spark in the vast, cold darkness of the Alaskan winter, hinting at a connection she thought impossible. As the relentless grip of deep winter finally began to loosen its hold, ushering in the first hesitant promises of longer days, a fragile sense of renewal began to bloom across the vast landscape. However, with the thawing of the land came an unexpected and profoundly unwelcome arrival. One blustery afternoon, as Elara was checking her river traps, a lone figure emerged from the swirling snow, his silhouette stark against the white expanse. He was a trapper, grizzled and gaunt, with a hard glint in his eyes that seemed to pierce the distance. His name was Jensen, and as he drew closer, a cold dread settled in Elara's stomach. He looked at her. Then a flicker of recognition, a slow, predatory smile spread across his chapped lips. "Elara, is that truly you?" he rasped, his voice rough with disuse. The recognition was immediate, a chilling, undeniable truth that shattered the fragile peace she had so painstakingly constructed in this desolate corner of the world. Jensen had known her in another life, a life she had desperately tried to bury beneath layers of snow, silence, and self-imposed exile. He spoke of her past, his words cutting through the crisp air like shards of ice, recounting a broken promise, a desperate act, and whispered accusations that had once driven her to flee. He spoke of a secret, a profound sacrifice she had made, twisting it with malicious intent. Elara's carefully constructed facade, years in the making, began to crack. Her face, usually a mask of stoicism, betrayed a flicker of the old pain, the raw fear she thought she had long since conquered. Silas, returning from his own trapline, observed the tense exchange from a distance. He saw the sudden rigidness in Elara's posture, the way her shoulders stiffened, her gaze hardening as Jensen's venomous accusations hung in the frigid air. A prickle of unease, then a deeper sense of alarm settled in his gut. The truth, whatever it was clearly a monumental burden she had carried in secret for too long. Jensen's presence brought with it not just a clear and present threat to her newfound tenuous peace, but also a deeper, more unsettling question for Silas. What was Elara truly hiding? The comfortable silence that had grown between them was abruptly replaced by a thick, uncomfortable tension, a sudden gaping chasm of unspoken truths. The wilderness, usually a refuge, now felt like a stark, unforgiving stage for a drama Elara had hoped never to revisit, a past she thought she had outrun forever. Jensen's venomous accusations, though still vague and laced with malicious innuendo, had done their damage. They had chipped away at the solid, unyielding wall Elara had built around her heart. The weight of her unspoken past became a palpable, suffocating presence in the small cabin, pressing down on both her and Silas. One evening, after Jensen had finally departed, promising a return, Elara sat by the flickering light of the fire, its warmth doing little to dispel the chill that had settled deep within her. She looked at Silas, her gaze unwavering, a profound decision etched on her face. Her voice, usually so steady and devoid of emotion, was laced with a barely perceptible tremor as she began to speak. "There's a reason I came here," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "A reason I live like this." She recounted her story, not with self-pity, but with a raw, unflinching honesty. It was a tale of desperation and impossible choices, born not of her own wrongdoing, but of a desperate struggle to protect the only family she had left, her younger sister. Her sister had been gravely ill, wasting away with a fever that no local remedies could touch. Elara, young and naive, had sought help from powerful men in a distant, bustling settlement, men who had promised assistance for a price that ultimately demanded a sacrifice of her integrity, a choice that left her emotionally scarred and branded as cold. She had been forced into an impossible bargain, a life-altering decision that had saved her sister, but condemned Elara to a life of quiet suffering and profound isolation. She described the betrayal, the callous indifference she faced, and the impossible choice that had forced her to leave everything behind. Silas listened, his expression unwavering, his gaze fixed on her face. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire and the ragged edges of Elara's raw confession. He saw the profound pain in her eyes, the years of quiet suffering, and a deep, aching sadness settled over him. His initial judgment, the blunt declaration that she was too cold to love any man, felt utterly hollow now, a cruel misinterpretation. It was replaced by a dawning understanding, a profound realization. He understood that the coldness he perceived was not a lack of emotion, but a profound shield, a defense mechanism built out of sheer necessity, a fortress erected to protect a heart that had been broken and betrayed. The sacrifice she described, though she did not detail its full agonizing extent, hinted at a deep, self-sacrificing love that had been tragically misinterpreted and unjustly punished by a world that valued reputation over compassion. The harsh realities of her past, far from making her unlovable, revealed a depth of character, a fierce loyalty, and a resilience he had never imagined. The weight of her secret now shared seemed to subtly lighten, bringing a fragile, almost imperceptible shift in the oppressive atmosphere of the cabin. The truth, once spoken aloud, seemed to lift a palpable, suffocating weight from Elara's shoulders, though the sharp, persistent ache of memory still lingered. Silas, now understanding the immense burden she had carried in secret for so long, felt a profound shift in his perception of her. His earlier harsh assessment of her coldness was entirely replaced by a deep, unwavering respect for her resilience, her unwavering loyalty, and the immense sacrifice she had made. He saw not a lack of emotion, but a formidable fortress built to protect a heart that had been repeatedly wounded. He didn't offer empty platitudes or trite reassurances. Instead, he offered something far more valuable and meaningful. A quiet, unwavering presence, a solid anchor in the storm of her past. He listened, truly listened, to the unspoken pain in her words, to the quiet suffering that had shadowed her for years. The shift in their dynamic was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but profoundly significant. The formidable wall that had stood between them, a barrier of unspoken truths and carefully guarded emotions, began to crumble, replaced by a newfound understanding and a deeper, more profound connection. Silas began to help her with her traplines, not just out of practical necessity or the simple neighborly gestures of the past, but as a silent, unwavering gesture of support. He brought her warm, nourishing broth when she was weary from the cold, and sometimes they would simply sit by the fire, the silence between them no longer one of wary distance, but of shared empathy, a comfortable, companionable quiet. Elara, in turn, found herself slowly, tentatively leaning on his quiet strength, a comfort she hadn't realized she craved, a hand outstretched in a world that had taught her to only rely on herself. She found herself sharing small observations about the wilderness, a rare smile playing on her lips as they watched the aurora borealis dance across the night sky. The bleak, unforgiving Alaskan landscape, once a stark symbol of her crushing solitude, now seemed to hold a flicker of shared warmth, a fragile promise of connection in a world that had once seemed utterly devoid of it. The weight of her solitary fight seemed to lessen, knowing there was someone who understood, someone who saw past the facade to the resilient heart beneath. Just as a fragile sense of peace began to settle over their remote existence, a dark premonition of winter's end, Jensen, the insidious shadow from Elara's past, reappeared. His return was not a chance encounter, but a calculated, malevolent intrusion. This time, he wasn't merely bearing old accusations. He was driven by a deeper, more sinister motive, one rooted in avarice and desperation. He had somehow learned of a hidden cache of prime furs Elara had meticulously amassed over the harsh winter, a significant fortune that represented her chance at a truly new life, a future finally free from the spectre of her past. Jensen, ruthless and devoid of conscience, saw an opportunity to seize it for himself, to strip her of everything she had worked for. He arrived on a biting afternoon, not alone, but with two other men, equally hardened and dangerous, their faces etched with the same hungry greed that distorted Jensen's own features. Their intentions were unmistakable, their presence a palpable threat hanging heavy in the frigid air. The remote wilderness, which had once been Elara's impenetrable refuge, suddenly felt like a meticulously laid trap closing in around them. Elara and Silas were woefully outnumbered and isolated, miles from any semblance of civilization. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating, a silent alarm screaming in Elara's mind. The late-season blizzard that had begun to brew, which had once been their greatest adversary, now offered a strange, almost ironic sense of protection. Its furious onset made travel incredibly difficult for Jensen and his cronies, hindering their approach. Yet it also made any thought of escape for Elara and Silas nearly impossible. Elara, her resolve hardened by years of survival against impossible odds, knew instinctively that they faced a desperate, brutal fight. Her mind raced, calculating their meager defenses, the angles of attack, the potential for using the brutal environment against their assailants. Silas, his eyes fixed on the approaching figures through the swirling snow, felt a primal instinct surge within him, a fierce, unyielding loyalty to protect Elara, a protective instinct that had grown silently in the cold, expansive heart of the Alaskan wilderness. The struggle for survival had taken on a terrifying new dimension, pitting them not merely against the unforgiving elements, but against the predatory, vicious nature of desperate men. The quiet solitude they had found together was about to be violently shattered, replaced by the chaotic terror of human conflict. The brutal confrontation erupted amidst a raging, merciless blizzard, the wind whipping snow into a blinding, suffocating fury that swallowed all light and sound. Jensen and his two desperate, greedy men, their faces contorted by avarice, launched their assault on Elara and Silas's cabin, their shouts barely audible above the relentless howl of the wind. Elara and Silas fought with the desperate, primal courage of those who had everything to lose. Elara, her movements fluid and precise, used her intimate knowledge of the treacherous terrain and the elements to her advantage. She moved like a phantom through the swirling snow, disappearing and reappearing in the whiteout, setting small, clever snares and booby traps that disoriented and slowed their attackers. She aimed well-placed rocks, hidden in snowdrifts, designed to trip or momentarily stun, buying precious seconds. Silas, a formidable figure in the chaotic storm, defended the cabin entrance with a ferocity that surprised even himself, his every move fueled by a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. He wielded an axe with surprising agility, forcing Jensen's men to keep their distance. The fight was brutal, a desperate, chaotic dance of survival against overwhelming odds. The bitter cold, once their primary adversary, now became a strange, ambivalent ally and enemy. It numbed their limbs, making every movement a Herculean effort, yet it also weakened their assailants, slowing their reactions and clouding their judgment. One of Jensen's men stumbled, overcome by a combination of the elements and a well-aimed, bone-jarring blow from Silas. He collapsed into a snowdrift, his struggles quickly diminishing. Jensen, enraged by the loss and the unexpected resistance, pressed the attack with renewed, desperate fervor, but the blizzard, a force far more powerful and unpredictable than any man, began to truly take its toll. The sheer ferocity of the storm disoriented them all, turning the advantage away from Jensen, blurring his vision and freezing his resolve. Silas, seeing a momentary opening as Jensen struggled against a sudden, violent gust of wind, lunged forward. Their bodies collided, a brutal impact, and their struggle was immediately swallowed by the swirling, blinding snow. Elara, though her side ached from a glancing blow and her breath was ragged in her lungs, moved to support Silas, her determination unyielding. She saw Jensen attempting to draw a knife, and with a burst of adrenaline, she swept his feet out from under him, sending him sprawling into a deep drift. The wilderness, the very force that had once isolated them in its vast, indifferent embrace, now became an unpredictable and treacherous battleground, determining their ultimate fate in its frigid, unforgiving grip. The furious blizzard, having expended its terrifying energy, finally broke, leaving behind a world hushed and pristine, covered in a thick, insulating blanket of fresh, untouched snow. The first rays of the dawn sun pierced through the receding clouds, painting the vast landscape in soft hues of pink and gold, transforming the treacherous wilderness into a scene of breathtaking, almost ethereal beauty. Jensen and his remaining man, battered, defeated, and thoroughly broken by both the desperate fight and the overwhelming, unforgiving elements, had retreated. Their desperate greed had been utterly overridden by the primal instinct to survive the wrath of the storm, forcing them to abandon their wicked pursuit. Elara and Silas, bruised, exhausted, but ultimately victorious, emerged from the cabin, the crisp, clean air filling their aching lungs, a profound sense of relief washing over them. The furs, the valuable cash that had been the source of Jensen's avarice, were safe, scattered, but salvageable. But more importantly, their bond, a fragile thread woven in shared silence, had been forged into an unbreakable cable in the crucible of shared adversity. Silas looked at Elara, his eyes no longer cold or guarded, but filled with a deep, unwavering respect and an undeniable, tender warmth. He remembered his blunt, thoughtless words from their first meeting, "You're too cold to love any man," and a pang of deep regret pierced him. He now saw, with profound clarity, the true depth of her love, the immense, heartbreaking sacrifice she had made for her sister, and the indomitable strength that lay beneath her quiet, stoic exterior. "You're not cold, Elara," he said, his voice husky with genuine emotion, a rare warmth bleeding into his gruff tone. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known, and the bravest." Elara met his gaze, a rare, soft smile finally gracing her lips, a smile that spoke not only of the pain of the past, but also of healing, of newfound trust, and of the profound promise of a future finally free from the shadows. The scars of her past, both physical and emotional, remained, but they were now shared, understood, and no longer a source of shame or isolation. They stood together, two solitary figures who were no longer truly alone, side by side, facing the vast, beautiful, and utterly unforgiving Alaskan wilderness. They were ready to build a life together, not merely of grim survival, but of genuine connection, of shared warmth and of hope. The deep freeze had finally broken, and the thaw had come, not just in the majestic landscape around them, but more profoundly in their long frozen hearts. Remember to subscribe to the channel for more immersive stories like this.